You're here for a theory, but I suspect there could be another reason you came to this video. Tell me, are you a synth? Hello everyone, and welcome to my first and potentially only theory video. Why maybe the only one? Well, because I'm not really a theory channel. This one just happened to be a topic close to my heart, concerning my favorite game of my favorite franchise, Fallout 4. If you're a Fallout fan like me, you've probably seen hundreds of theory videos floating around about the games, and many of those covering the same topic as we're covering in this video, the question of whether the sole survivor is actually a synth. Now, if you've never played Fallout 4, why'd you click on this video? None of this is gonna make sense to you, go play the game! But if you're stubborn and just want to watch this video with no context, then I'll give you a brief rundown. Basically, in Fallout 4 you play as the sole survivor of a bomb shelter, or vault, where you were frozen, your spouse was killed and your son kidnapped, and then the cryopods malfunctioned and killed everyone else, leaving only you. You go on a mission into the wasteland to find your stolen son, learn that he was kidnapped by an underground science team so they could make robot replacements of humans called synths, and after finding them you learn it's been 60 years since that day, and your son has grown up to become the leader of that group, and you can decide from there what you want to do about that. All caught up? Good, then let's move on. In Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, one of the main characters, a synth named Dima, asks the sole survivor if they themselves are a synth, to which we have many possible responses.
One more question, if you'll indulge me. You're here for Kasumi, but I suspect there could be another reason you came to us. Tell me, are you a synth?
But despite the answers we can give, there's no clear determination as to whether we're actually a synth. The only true evidence is from examining a dead body to see if it has a specific component, and since we can't loot our own dead body, we have to look for evidence elsewhere. I've grouped the areas we're going to cover into 3 sections. First, we'll look at tests, that is, the few in-game tests we can encounter for synth detection. It's a short list, so that's why we'll cover it first. Next, we'll look at environment, by which I mean the actions of other characters and factions that might give us some clues as to what they might know. Finally, memory. One of Dima's main arguments for us being a synth is our lack of memory, but I believe there are many instances that the sole survivor remembers more than they say, and that these are the true key to determining if we're human or synth. So, without further ado, let's get into the theory. The first test I want to address is a little controversial, as we don't actually take the test in-game, but we do see the results of other people who have, and it can be assumed we did too. During the Brotherhood of Steel quest Blind Betrayal, we learn that Paladin Danse is a synth, thanks to Proctor Quinlan's research on the Institute's terminal data. In this data, Quinlan found a list of escaped synths, alongside their photos and DNA, which is how he identified Danse.
It appears that the Institute keeps exemplary records where their synths are concerned, including logging those that were reported missing. As I was perusing this list, I came across an image of Danse under the heading M797. A quick DNA comparison with our own records told the rest of the tale.
Elder Maxon tells us that they also store DNA data on every Brotherhood soldier, of which the sole survivor is one if you've gotten this far into the questline.
The evidence is quite damning. The data you brought back included a record of each subject's DNA. We keep the same information on file for all of our soldiers.
Now, in-game, we never take a blood test for the Brotherhood. In fact, the only medical exam we undertake is just answering questions. However, Captain Kells makes a point to tell us that we're not getting any special treatment, so it's possible that we did have our blood taken and it just wasn't shown.
As the captain of this vessel, I won't allow anyone to jeopardize our mission, no matter how valuable they think they are.
In fact, we know some things must happen in the background during the Brotherhood questline, because if we don't tell Danse that we were in a vault when we meet him, Knight Captain Cade checks his notes and sees we're a vault dweller.
From a local settlement?
I'm from Sanctuary Hills, on the other side of Concord.
I've seen the location on our maps, but I've never visited the area myself.
Before the bombs? What? Let me check my notes. You were a vault dweller?
But how did he know if we never told anyone? Something must have happened in the background. So if we did get our blood taken, then it should have shown up on Quinlan's list if we were a synth. Even without the blood, photos were still on the list, so the sole survivor should have been recognized. Though, this is where things get a little confusing. During the Railroad questline, we meet a guy called Highrise, who tells us that the escaped synth we're helping, H222, is going to get a new face and new memories.
Hey, you okay?
A little rattled, but I've never been better. The other man, he said I shouldn't talk too much.
He told you right, H2. You'll need a real name and a new face, but we'll get to that.
But if synths are given new faces, how would there be a photo matching Dance? And to make things even more confusing, later on in the questline, we can go see H2 after he's had his memories changed, and he still looks the same, no new face. So, was Highrise wrong? Do synths not undergo facial reconstruction? Well, seemingly not. In Fallout 3, during the quest The Replicated Man, we learn that Harkness, an escaped synth, got his facial reconstruction done in Rivet City by Horace Pinkerton, not before he left the Commonwealth.
I'm also the only one in the Wasteland with the skill and the nerve to perform facial surgery. That android flesh ain't so different than ours.
I guess Highrise noticed Deacon constantly changing his face and assumed the synths had the same surgery? But since the list Quinlan found was only for escaped synths, maybe it didn't include us, as it seems unlikely we would have escaped and then put ourselves in a cryopod sealed away in a distant vault. So perhaps this test isn't a definite point of proof, as a lot of things surrounding it are very unclear, but we still have more to look at. Enter the second test, the safe test. In the town of Covenant, a secret group is working to uncover a way to detect synths using psychology, making travelers answer a series of questions and using the answers to determine if the person is human or a synth.
Jesus, listen. Not everyone in the Commonwealth is human, okay? Some are synths. I'm not gonna say anything more than that. Just take the test. You pass, and you can come inside where everything's safe, alright?
The research is still ongoing and incredibly brutal, but according to the lead researcher, Dr. Rosalind Chambers, they actually get a really high number of false positives. About 4 or 5 people the test flags as a synth turn out to be human, for every 1 actual synth.
The test is in its infancy, but through sacrifice and perseverance, our success rate is improving.
And the safe test works?
Oh, yes. Autopsies confirm the test is getting more accurate. There's something in the questions which provokes a response from synth, but the exact trigger is elusive. The margin of error is admittedly high, 4 or 5 false positives per synth.
So, it seems like the test is more inclined to say someone is a synth rather than a human. And what happens when the sole survivor takes the safe test? They're allowed into Covenant. They're deemed to be human. Of course, the test could be wrong, but the odds are certainly in our favor. Still, I think we can do more to prove our humanity, so let's move on to our next subject. In terms of environment, there are 2 main factions who deal with synths, the Railroad and the Institute. But before we get to them, there are 2 individuals I want to look at, Mama Murphy and Codsworth. We'll start with Mama Murphy because I think she's the easiest to explain. When we meet Mama Murphy in Sanctuary, she'll tell us that she knows our energy is tied to the settlement, and that she even saw us leaving the vault.
But the distant past ain't so distant for you. I saw you leave that icebox. This whole world is like some bad dream you can't wake up from, isn't it?
We know Mama Murphy's visions are accurate, from talking about the Deathclaw that attacks us in Concord, to giving us passcodes and phrases that let us avoid fights with Skinny Malone and the Corsair in Green Tech. So, does Mama Murphy's sight prove we're human? Well, not exactly. Remember, she only claims seeing the sole survivor leave the vault, not enter it. So it's still possible they're a synth that was placed in there. Regardless, I'd still recommend listening to your favorite fortune teller. Now for Codsworth. When we leave the vault and return to Sanctuary, we can meet with our old robot butler, Codsworth, who immediately recognizes us from before the war. So, case closed, right? Well, no, not really. As a robot, Codsworth could very easily have been hacked by the Institute when they came to the vault, or at any time, really. It could be that's how they know so much about the sole survivor, though that might not actually be very much, as Codsworth's box is still in the house at the start of the game, so he could have been around for as little as a single day, or maybe a few weeks. Either way, I'd say Codsworth isn't necessarily a reliable source for deciding if we're human or synth. Now to the Railroad, and right from the get-go, we see evidence of the Railroad's involvement with the sole survivor. Immediately after leaving the vault, we can find an outpost looking at the vault door, with a rail sign marked on the woodwork. the real sign for ally. So, someone was here that knew there was an ally inside the vault. But how? We know the Railroad helped synths escape the Institute, so maybe they helped the sole survivor? The Railroad do give rescued synths fake memories, so that would lend some support to the synth theory. Though, why would they put them in a cryopod in the Commonwealth, rather than send them outside the Commonwealth like they do with all the other synths they help? Especially in a vault we know the Institute has been to before, and presumably the Railroad knows it too, given that Deacon tells us that Kellogg, the guy who stole our son, was their #1 enemy.
The Railroad owes you a crate, hell, a truckload of Nuka-Cola for what you did to Kellogg. He was our public enemy #1.
So if the sole survivor is a synth, and the Railroad didn't put them in the vault, then was it the Institute? Father, or Sean, whatever you want to call him, does tell us about our release from the vault if we ask him, and he tells us that we were an experiment, a curiosity, to see what we'd do when we were let out.
I'll admit, when I had you released from Vault 111, I had no expectations that you'd survive out here in all this. To not only do so, but manage to find me. To infiltrate the Institute itself. Extraordinary.
So it was you. You let me out.
Yes. It was my decision. Certainly it was no longer necessary to keep you suspended. Well, I suppose I wanted to see what would happen. An experiment of sorts.
Some people have taken this to mean that the sole survivor is actually a synth, made to look like Sean's parent and given a few fake memories, then placed in the vault and released, all as father's private experiment. The Institute doesn't typically give memories to synths, even the ones they use for infiltration and replacement, like Mayor McDonough. They're just given a brief to memorize. However, there is a notable exception in Nick Valentine, the synthetic detective, who was given the memories of a pre-war cop of the same name.
My memories, my personality, they're all lifted from some cop who volunteered for an experiment back before the war. They scanned his brain and copied it onto the hardware that runs between my ears.
So, we know in the case of prototypes and experiments, the Institute is willing to give synths fake memories. And this isn't the only thing in the Institute that has led people to believe in the synth theory. In the robotics department, there's a terminal you can find that describes a unique project for Gen 3 synths, who can understand weapon accuracy to the extent of visualizing percentage of hitting targets, and have an altered perception of time that mimics slowing or stopping of time, both of which are a pretty accurate description of the VAT system we can use. The trouble with that is, if the only way we could have that ability was by being this type of synth, then every playable character in the previous games would also have to be one, which is incredibly unlikely. So we could just be using the VATs from our Pip-Boy. People have pointed out that you can actually use VATs before even picking up the Pip-Boy as evidence of this experimental synth tech. However, you have to remember that this escape from the vault functions as the game's tutorial. It has to teach you how things work. Admittedly, it is an odd choice for the Pip-Boy to be at the end of the tutorial, but also, this is Bethesda. Another moment people have pointed to for the synth theory is the moment that Father declares us to be his successor as leader of the Institute, claiming that everyone is so outraged because they don't want a synth to lead them.
To that end, I am naming my father as my successor.
Oh, boy.
You can't be serious!
Really?
How can you possibly justify this? He isn't one of us. He isn't even a scientist.
This also seems very unlikely, because if that was the case, then why wouldn't they just say it? The Institute repeatedly says and shows that they think of synths as tools, not people, so it's not like they'd care about hurting our feelings. Not to mention, some of the scientists actually stage a coup during the quest A House Divided, cutting off the bioscience division and preventing people from accessing food and medical supplies unless we announce that we won't be accepting the leadership position. If everyone was aware that the sole survivor is a synth, then that would suggest they would rather kill everyone slowly than mention the fact we're a synth. So maybe nobody knows, but that at least disproves the meeting outrage argument as evidence for it. There are a few other things inside the Institute that I believe also point to the fact that the sole survivor isn't a synth experiment. For one, Father can't make synths by himself. Someone would have to make one for him. We see this when we visit Madison Lee, who has a holotape about her thoughts of making the synth child Sean, who was another of Father's projects.
Of course, it's not really Sean. None of his memories are in there. That, even now, would be a step too far. It's starting to have an effect on the team, I think. I know I've been caught up in the moment once or twice. Just a second or two, forgetting that he's not a real boy. Still, I think we'll need to consider restricting him to the lab only for the moment. I'm well aware that others are put off by his presence. If I were slightly more arrogant, I might consider that a sign of success.
Also, we can access Father's terminal in his room, where he writes about having Justin Ayo monitoring our journey. At no point does he mention us being a synth experiment in his own diary. Well, I think I've done a pretty good job of uncovering why the Soul Survivor isn't a synth, but if you're still not convinced, I have one final category that can help me prove that we're not a synth, by examining exactly what the Soul Survivor remembers and who else could have known these things. There are actually plenty of things the Soul Survivor remembers before the day of the bombs, contrary to what they said to Dima. Admittedly, these things are all small points and not a fully fleshed out memory like the events of October 23rd, but the fact they even exist suggests the Soul Survivor remembers more than that one event. Firstly, they remember Edward Grey, the founder of Grey Garden. They don't remember him personally, but they remember hearing about him.
We are capable of complex analysis and decision-making, a testament to the genius of our creator, Dr. Edward Grey.
I remember him. He was one of Robco's senior engineers, but more than a little eccentric.
Now, if the Soul Survivor is an Institute synth with fake memories, it's possible they gave them some additional knowledge. And we know the Institute has an interest in Grey Garden because of their attempt to recruit a scientist living on the property, so perhaps they put in that little bit of info on Edward. Funny enough, there's actually a second Edward that the Soul Survivor remembers, Eddie Winter. Eddie was a Boston crime boss that we can learn a lot about through Nick's questline, as the original Nick was the detective assigned to investigate Eddie, only for Eddie to be granted immunity in exchange for ratting out other criminals.
Eddie Winter was from my time. Real scumbag.
Now, there are two sources this info could come from, aside from the Soul Survivor remembering it. The first is obvious. Nick is a synth, and the Institute specifically put his memories in him, so they'd know about Eddie from that. Even if they didn't, there are surviving newspapers all over the wasteland with the headline about Eddie on them, so it's easy enough to learn about. One random memory the Soul Survivor can have is about old radio broadcasts, specifically the Silver Shroud stories. During the Silver Shroud questline, we can tell Kent that we used to listen to every new episode, and when we tell him about our backstory, he'll compare us to a character, Mr. Abominable, who we remember.
You ever listen to the Silver Shroud? That's what we need. No matter how bleak things got, he saved the day.
My family and I used to listen to every new episode.
You mean when they first aired? How? The last broadcast was hundreds of years ago.
I was in cryogenic storage for a long time. I only just woke up.
Oh man, that's amazing! You're just like Mr. Abominable from episode 83.
Wasn't he a caveman?
Yeah, that's the one.
Now, I spent a lot of time listening to the Silver Shroud radio specifically to see if there was an episode featuring Mr. Abominable, and there wasn't. In fact, there are only 6 episodes, all focused on Mayor Murphy. If there was one about Mr. Abominable, it didn't survive the bombs. So, if the Institute put this memory in us just for a bit of fun, how did they know about Mr. Abominable? You could argue that they took an educated guess about Mr. Abominable being a frozen caveman, but is that really anyone's first thought? I bet that when you hear the word abominable, the first thing you think of is snowman, right? Not caveman. So why would the Institute think he was a caveman? I doubt they did any extensive research just for this one tiny memory. And without leaving Goodneighbor, there's another character we can meet to give credence to our humanity. Take a visit to Hotel Rexford and you can find none other than the Vault-Tec rep. The guy who gave us our space in the vault is still alive and well, living as a ghoul in Goodneighbor. And when we meet him, he recognizes us immediately.
It's you! From Sanctuary Hills, right?
Wait, are you from Vault-Tec?
I am Vault-Tec.
Now, Goodneighbor is actually surprisingly adept at keeping the Institute out. So much so that it's even mentioned in one of the loading screen tips we can read. We can actually witness a guard having put down a synth replica of a Goodneighbor resident. So, the likelihood of the Institute having come to Goodneighbor to get info from this one ghoul seems unlikely. How would they even know of his existence in the first place, or his connection to the Soul Survivor? Father tells us that he was kidnapped in the year 2227, 150 years after the bombs fell. It seems unlikely that the Vault-Tec rep would have been in Sanctuary all that time, though he wouldn't have been a good neighbor since that town wasn't founded until 2240. But the question still remains of how would they even have taken an interest in him before Good Neighbor? And why would they waste time basing a fake memory of a Vault-Tec rep on a real person, copying his speech and mannerisms? I don't think they would. There are a few other little memories the Soul Survivor has, such as remembering the name of Nuka-Cola's inventor.
Brad Burton. I remember that name. He was the guy who invented Nuka-Cola, right?
Exactly! Wow, not a lot of people know that. At least not anymore.
And remembering adverts for Pellman's power tools. A memory we have in Far Harbor DLC, by the way, the very DLC that asked us what we remember.
There! A premium set of Pellman's power tools.
I remember commercials for Pellman's tools. Expensive stuff, the top of the line.
What the hell's a commercial?
But aside from these, there's one very important memory that I think proves the Soul Survivor is human. The very first memory, the day of the bombs. That's right, I believe that the memory we claim as our only memory before the war actually proves we're human, not a synth. And it comes from Nora's very first line.
War never changes.
You're gonna knock him dead at the Veterans Hall tonight, hun.
The Veterans Hall. Now, anyone not native to Concord could be excused for thinking this refers to the fraternal post in Cambridge, where the Soul Survivor can use a microphone to repeat the ending words of Nate's speech. I mean, I know I did when I first came across it.
War. War never changes.
It was only when doing research for this theory that I learned the truth. The fraternal post is a location Nate would have done his speech. We can find a terminal in there that mentions Nate's address in Concord, and their desire to get him to do a speech here as well. That means the Concord speech is different from the fraternal post speech, or at least are two separate instances of the same speech. The fact that the Soul Survivor can repeat the lines there suggests that fraternal post did ask Nate to do the speech, but it's unknown if he agreed to it or not. So, if that's not the Veterans Hall, then what is? Well, it's actually an entirely unassuming little building opposite Concord's church. That's right, this is the Veterans Hall. If you look up 51 Walden Street in Concord, Massachusetts, you can find their website with the building's history, including its rebuilding in the 1920s where it was renamed the Veterans Building. You can also find an article with more detailed history on the Discover Concord website, and a more technical take on Wikipedia to discover the official name for the building is the Concord Armory. Look for it on Google Maps, and you'll see it's directly opposite the church, next to a little side lane, just like we see here in-game. But you're probably thinking, okay Jim, so what if that's the Veterans Hall? The Institute could have known that too and put it in the memory. Well, maybe not. And here's where I'm going to get a bit controversial about Fallout lore. You see, there's no exact date for when the Divergence occurred, the event where our real-world timeline split off to the alternate dimension in Fallout, just that it was sometime after 1945 and the ending of the Second World War. There's nothing saying it was exactly 1945. In fact, there are loads of things we see in Fallout 4 that were actually built decades after. The Freedom Trail was built in 1951, Spectacle Island was a trash dump from 1935, and soil was only placed atop it in 1992. And Columbus Park, which isn't a named location in Fallout 4, but is the location you can see here with the wooden trellis, was funded in 1974 and completed in 1976. But there's another detail that suggests that the divergence may have happened around the same time as Columbus Park. In Fallout 2 and Fallout 76, there's actually mention of Richard Nixon, with Fallout 2 having a talking Nixon doll as a quest item, and Fallout 76 listing him on a multiple choice question about which president was a former wrestler. Nixon was the US president from 1969 to 1974, though was a politician from the 1940s. However, while I won't go into the events of his presidency, it was certainly notable, and it's unlikely Nixon would get a mention for anything outside of his presidential term, especially since the talking doll apparently quotes famous phrases from his term. If that's the case, and the divergence still hadn't occurred by 1974, then the Veterans Hall in Concord has an interesting event we need to take notice of. You see, the building wasn't getting enough repairs and maintenance, and was getting so bad it was being considered for demolition in 1958, though the funds couldn't be raised. However, in 1972, the Friends of Performing Arts was formed as a charity with the intent to renovate the building as a performing arts center, renaming the building after the organization. if the divergence didn't occur until around 1974, then the Veterans Hall would have been called the Performing Arts Center at the time, and only colloquially known as the Veterans Hall. Not to mention that even if the divergence did occur before 1974, the building was in such disrepair that there was a proposal to demolish it in 1958, meaning that it probably wasn't used for much before then, and making it an unlikely place to host a speech. And we can see the building in the game, with no signage remaining after the bombs, nothing on it saying either Performing Arts Center or Veterans Hall. In fact, taking a look at old Google Maps photos of the building pre-2015, the year it changed its name to 51 Walden, shows there were no signs on the building referring to it as the Veterans Hall, just the acronym FOPAC, Friends of Performing Arts Center. And remember, the bombs dropped in 2077, 105 years after the Veterans Hall was bought by FOPAC, if that indeed did happen in this timeline. But even if that never happened in the Fallout timeline, the only way the Institute would know the building was referred to as the Veterans Hall would be if some member of the Institute was a descendant of a conquered native who loved telling stories about the Performing Arts Center. Otherwise, there's no way they would know that's what the building was called in order to incorporate it into a fake memory. Especially since the building's official listed name, at least according to Wikipedia and the Register of Historic Places, is the Concord Armory. So if the Institute was digging around public records to try and find out this building's name, that's what they'd find. But Jim, I hear you cry. 1972 was 27 years after 1945. That's not a short time after. Well, yes and no. 27 years is not a short time if that's your only reference point. I'm 30 years old and it seems like a long time to me. But remember, the bombs dropped in 2077. That's 132 years after 1945. 27 years doesn't even make up for 1/3 of that time. Taking that context into account, it suddenly seems a lot shorter, doesn't it? And all of this effort seems incredibly wasteful when there's a terminal in the building only a couple hundred feet from the Institute's figurative doorstep, saying that they're all going to ask Nate to do a speech there. A terminal that is probably the only hint that Nate was performing a speech in Concord, and doesn't even mention what building that speech was performed in. If they were going to create a memory about Nate performing a speech, why not make it at the place there's evidence for it? So there you have it, all of my reasons as to why I am 99% sure the sole survivor is not a synth. If you think there's anything I've missed, feel free to comment on this video and I might address your point either in a reply or in another video if I think it's a big enough point. Until then, thank you all so much for watching. If you want to catch me live on Twitch, you can follow me at CursedJimKenbrook, where I play a variety of games and do tarot readings for chat members if that interests you. But for now, I hope you all take amazing care of yourselves, and may fate and fortune find you well, my friends.